Welcome to the future. PBS Digital.
In the world they left behind, they were second-class citizens, dominated by law and custom by men.
There was segregation, there was apartheid, there were zero rights for women.
Some feared for their lives.
Her husband would put his knife to her throat and he would say, you know, I could kill you right now.
Others were searching for new opportunities.
Psychologically, she did end up a rich woman as a result of this migration experience.
Next on Destination America, Breaking Free, A Woman's Journey.
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
They have come from all over the world. Their faces have changed, not their reasons. In flight from poverty, persecution, war. Drawn by the shimmering promise of America. There is a slow and predictable rhythm to life in Guatemala. For Guatemalan women, the hours are filled with daily tasks. But beneath the surface lies a quiet desperation. Women live at the mercy of their husbands, who may beat them with impunity. In Guatemala, 6 out of 10 women murdered die at the hands of the men they marry. Rodi Alvarado was almost one of those statistics. Abused by her husband for nearly 10 years, Rodi feared for her life.
Yo sabía que yo tenía que salir. Y pues cuando tomé la decisión de salir sin saber a dónde ni cómo, pero yo tenía que salir de ese lugar. Que yo no traía ni un centavo, yo no traía nada, absolutamente nada.
Rodi sought refuge in America. Her petition for political asylum may become a landmark case. If she wins, it will be the first time America has ever granted asylum to a woman fleeing domestic violence. For hundreds of years, women came to America and confronted a culture unlike anything they had ever known. In America, there were new possibilities. Many would break with old world traditions. Some would even learn to demand their freedom. Remarkable women like Rosa, who left Italy in 1887. Ferdoos Iranian, who arrived from Iran in 1954. And Rodi Alvarado from Guatemala. Rodi Alvarado grew up in a society ravaged by violence. In 1954, 14 years before she was born, Guatemala erupted into civil war. The fighting lasted 36 years and claimed the lives of more than 200,000 people. Soldiers in the Guatemalan army massacred innocent civilians. Women were brutalized and raped. It was the toxic mix of machismo and violence that would one day drive Rodi to America.
Nuestra cultura viene enraizada de la violencia desde el problema que vivimos, un conflicto armado que duró tantos años. En esos años dejaron muchas huellas. El problema que se ha dado es de que muchos hombres, las que huyeron del conflicto armado, nunca fueron asistidas psicológicamente. Cuando eran niños huyeron de esas masacres, vieron la forma como mutilaban o asesinaban a sus padres, nunca fueron tratados psicológicamente. Ellos en su edad adulta vienen a reflejar esa violencia, que nunca fueron tratados desde pequeños.
When she was 16, Rhody married a former soldier in the Guatemalan army.
The Guatemalan army was known to have committed gross and pervasive human rights violations throughout the conduct of that war. Rhody's husband would describe to her how he and his fellow soldiers would, for instance, take a baby, just toss it up in the air and take turns shooting at it. He would tell her about how they would enclose innocent civilian people in a home and set that home on fire and burn them to death.
Like most Guatemalan women, Rhody was poor and uneducated, dependent on her husband for survival.
Pues a la verdad que hasta ahora yo creo que es difícil hablar acerca de esto porque las mujeres hasta hoy no tienen ningún derecho. Simplemente el derecho de la mujer es servir y trabajar y atender a sus maridos como esclavas, creo.
Men grow up believing that a husband has a right to beat his wife. Domestic abuse is so accepted, the government turns a blind eye, even to women in danger.
Rhody's husband would put his knife to her throat and he would say, you know, I could kill you right now, and you know what? Nobody would care about it and nobody would do anything about it.
Every day, scores of women come to Guatemala City's police headquarters asking for help.
¿A usted aquí se le parece que ya la enviaron a un juzgado de familia?
Sí, ahorita ya me pasaron a un juzgado de familia, pero él me está amenazando. Él me dice que hay venganza. Si me vas a meter a un juicio, hay venganza. Yo solo eso te digo, mes. Que a mí me da miedo porque yo no quiero que me pase nada.
No, mire,
yo tengo miedo.
No, sí, por supuesto, pero no en...
Battered women quickly learn the police won't protect them.
¿A usted la ley la ampara?
Suli Vasquez had been living in the countryside with her 3 young children. When one day, her husband took her with him to gather wood.
Nos fuimos al monte, se puede decir, porque así se habla acá, al monte. Íbamos. Yo estaba viendo un árbol que tenía un nido de pajaritos. Lo que a mí me causó voltear la cabeza a ver fue de que el pajarito se levantó y voló. Cuando yo oigo que el balazo, ¡pa!, me dejó hasta sorda. Y dije, oh, Dios mío, ¿qué pasó aquí? Dije yo entre mí, en mi pensamiento. ¿Qué pasó? Me quiere matar. Fue la reacción que yo tuve.
Like Rhody, Suli went to the police.
Poner la denuncia en la policía cuando él ya lo sabía. Me volvió a dar otra paliza. Y realmente la policía no me puso atención. Bien me hubiera matado él que la policía ignoró mi caso.
Rhody also went to the courts and was turned away.
Yo no he sabido de ningún caso donde a un agresor se le ponga una pena drástica. Y ese es el problema que se da, que se empodera más al victimario, porque no hay una respuesta de parte de los jueces. Y nuestras leyes también, que son muy débiles en ese aspecto.
He llevado a las mujeres, los jueces dicen venga mañana o venga dentro de 8 días.
Hilda Morales, Guatemala's most experienced women's rights attorney, has been battling the legal system for decades.
Bueno, en algunos casos que yo he conocido, las mujeres ya han estado al borde de la muerte, tratando el marido les ha disparado, las ha fracturado, las ha herido, las ha tratado de ahorcar. Entonces las mujeres ya no tienen otra alternativa, tienen que irse.
Llegamos al límite de que ya no soportamos el abuso, el maltrato y llegamos a pensar de que solo muertos es solo la muerte tiene la solución.
Rhody was 27 years old and the mother of 2 small children when she made the decision to leave her family and flee to the United States.
It was only when Rhody reached the conclusion that if she remained in Guatemala, her husband would kill her. It was only then that she could actually rationalize to herself, if I remain, my children won't have a mother anyway, because my husband will kill me.
In June of 1995, Rhody illegally crossed the U.S. border and reached San Francisco. Within months, she found a legal aid attorney and filed for political asylum.
Our asylum system deals very well with a traditional concept of a classic refugee as someone who is a courageous political dissident. But what we move into when we move into the case of Rhody Alvarado, we move into a woman being persecuted because of her gender, because she's a woman.
For years, Rhody has been waiting for the courts to decide her case, painfully aware that never has a woman fleeing domestic violence been permitted to stay in America. Throughout America's history, immigrant women have come from the same parts of the world as men, and for many of the same reasons. Although at first they were far outnumbered by men, by the turn of the 20th century, they were coming in record numbers. In the village of Cugiono in northern Italy, almost everyone boasts of a relative in St. Louis, New York, or Chicago. Millions of Italians sailed for America between the 1880s and the 1920s. The men were the first to leave. Soon, more than 30% of immigrants were women. They were following their men across the ocean.
Women were told that it was their role, number one, to obey the man, and that they were inferior to the man, and that if they didn't obey the man, whether it was their father or their husband, they were really being disobedient to God himself. The man stands in the position of God, and you have to obey.
Today, the people of Cugiono have gathered together to celebrate the life of Rosa Cavalieri, who immigrated to America in 1887.
E Rosa cosa ci insegna? Ci insegna che al di là del denaro, al di là del potere, c'è qualcosa di più e di migliore che la solidarietà, come quella che Rosa stessa trovò a Chicago.
Like many immigrant women, Rosa would only challenge tradition after she left for America. 19th century Italy was a harsh place for young girls from poor families. We were always hungry, Rosa would later recall. In 1870, the year Rosa was born, silk making was the most important industry in Cuggiono. At the age of 5, Rosa was sent to work in one of the factories.
Piccolissimo, eh? Allora, un volontario alto alto. Vieni Camilla, te?
For school children today, the silkworm holds an honored place in the history of the community.
Hai notato cosa hai visto?
Though Rosa worked from sun up to sundown, she was fascinated by the little worms.
They're really chubby, and they've got a little snout like this, and I could see her. I mean, she didn't hate them. You'd think, you know, they were sort of a symbol of their slavery. They look like little pigs, and they did. They have that sort of little look of a little miniature pig, and very greedy pig, because they eat, and you can see them just devouring those mulberry leaves. They are rather cute.
Rosa was raised in a world deeply divided by class. The poor people didn't dare to look in the faces of the high people, she once said. They were always afraid.
Allora, nel volume viene più volte espresso questo da parte di Rosa, che il ricco è colui che in qualche modo può abusare o comunque sottomettere il povero. Poi il ricco poteva trattare il povero con sufficienza, potendolo anche maltrattare, picchiandolo semplicemente perché sbagliava qualcosa sul posto di lavoro.
When Rosa was only 15, her mother forced her to marry a local laborer named Santino, who had managed to save a little bit of money. The gruff older man terrified Rosa.
Part of her spirit was taken away from her with that, I think, with that forced marriage to a man she despised.
During the wedding ceremony in the Basilica of San Giorgio, Rosa was dazed. I couldn't say yes, she remembered. I was just there, that was all. Rosa's misery would only deepen. Soon the drinking and the beatings began. The birth of their son only further inflamed Santino's temper. As often as she could, she would kneel in front of the Madonna praying for a miracle. 2 years later, her prayers were answered. Northern Italy was providing thousands of workers for America's burgeoning industries. Santino decided to leave Italy to work in the iron mines of Missouri.
We have many, many stories of the departure of the immigrants, heart-wrenching stories. But Rosa's story was different from that. Rosa's story was relief. This man is gone.
Rosa returned to the silk factory while her mother watched over her son. Motherhood had given her happiness. But 18 months later, her world would come crashing down. Santino demanded she join him in America and leave her little boy behind. Madonna, she prayed, don't make me go to Santino. Rosa, you must go, her mother commanded. He is your husband. It would be a sin against God not to obey. As she drifted down the canal away from Cuggiono, a friend's parting words echoed in her mind. Don't feel bad, Rosa. You will get smart in America. Rosa landed in New York in 1887. one of more than 500,000 people entering the country that year. Everything was new and different. This was the land where no one went hungry, she told herself. When she boarded the train for Union, Missouri, she was shocked. The ladies wore hats, she observed, but they were riding the same class with us poor. After a 3-day journey, Rosa arrived at the mining camp. There she stood and stared at the reality of her new life.
Arriving in the mining camp in Missouri must have been a dramatic shock for Rosa. I cannot imagine. She finds herself in this dusty place with shacks. She's horrified. She is absolutely horrified.
Taking up life with Santino again, she tried to make a home out of the little shack. But Santino had become even more violent. The beatings continued. But in spite of the grim conditions, over time, Rosa's world began to open up. She grew friendly with other Americans. Miss Mabel at the local store. Mr. Miller at the post office. In America, she would later recall, the poor can talk to anyone.
Coming from a society where she knew what her place was, and her place was always as the inferior, the one who probably had to stand up if a signore, a gentleman or a signora walked in, all of a sudden finds herself in a place where she goes into a shop and the people treat her like a signora, like she's a lady.
2 years later, Rosa sailed back to Italy, only to discover how much of an American she had become. Santino had left his money in a bank in Cugiono and wanted Rosa to bring it to him.
When she goes inside the bank, she does something that she would have never dreamed of doing before. And that is, she sits down on chairs which were meant to be for the signori, for the upper classes, at which her friend tells her, you can't do this, you know, they're going to arrest you. And in fact, one of the guards calls and says, impertinenza, you know, impertinent, how dare you do this?
Men and women go to America and come back less deferent, less subservient, less humble. They simply wouldn't respect the etiquette of class difference. They wouldn't lower the eyes, bow the head, take off the hat.
Cugiono no longer felt like home. Rosa took her little boy and headed back to America. On the return trip, she began to plan the boldest move of her life. She would leave Santino. She returned to the mining camp, packed what she could, and while Santino was at work, fled with her son to Chicago. For the first time, Rosa was free. In 1890, Chicago was a magnet for thousands of immigrants, many of them arriving in groups and settling into distinct ethnic neighborhoods. In the Italian quarter, Rosa would run into old neighbors from Cugiono who helped her to get on her feet. Several years later, she found a steady job as a cleaning woman at the Chicago Commons, a settlement house that provided aid to immigrants. There, she learned she had a gift for storytelling. As crowds gathered around her to hear her tales of Cugiono, the mining camp, and the brutal Santino, a young social worker began writing down every word and snapped the only picture of Rosa known to exist. 30 years later, her stories were discovered and turned into a memoir.
Probably a lot more women had stories to tell, but we don't know what they are because no one bothered to listen. And someone bothered to listen to Rosa. And that makes her story almost unique because it's one of the few accounts of life and immigration from a woman's perspective that we have.
Rosa is a success story, but it's a different kind of success story because we can't say that she ended up a rich woman. She didn't, not in material gain, but psychologically, she did end up a rich woman because she was a changed woman as a result of this migration experience.
L'ultima frase di Rosa è che lei dice: io adesso non ho più paura, questo è quello che l'America mi ha insegnato. Ed è per quello che lei amava così tanto l'America. Rosa capisce con la sua intelligenza emotiva che l'uomo è uguale ad un altro uomo per dignità.
Today, the citizens of Cugiono honor Rosa by hanging a plaque in her memory in the town square.
Grazie, Rosa. Bentornata,
120 years after she sailed to America, the frightened young woman has become the heroine of her hometown in Italy. Rosa died in 1943 at the age of 73. Over the course of her life, women in the United States had won the vote, donned short skirts, supported their families during the Great Depression, and helped defend the nation during World War II. By the 1950s, women began attending universities in record numbers. But in many parts of the world, little had changed for women. In countries like Iran, traditions dated back centuries.
There was a time when the entire public space was forbidden to women. Women were in the private space, men were in the public space. There were zero rights for women. So in every way, a woman was considered the same as the insane or the people who were handicapped. These were the categories in which women were placed. So there was really very little that women could do.
Yet, even in Iran, women were beginning to break free. Ferdoos Nafisi had not set out to be a rebel. A child of a seamstress, she just hungered for something more.
My mother was yearning for knowledge, I think. She really wanted to continue her education. She really wanted to know more. She yearned to have information about the rest of the world.
In 1938, Ferdoos began to realize her dream when she became one of the first 3 women admitted to the University of Tehran. She studied Persian literature and memorized volumes of poetry.
As long as I can remember, my mother always told me that if I had it my way, I would be a student all my life. I love being a student.
Though it was one of the happiest times of her life, it would quickly slip away. In her second year at university, Ferdoos met a handsome European-educated man from one of Iran's richest families. Unable to resist a fairy tale marriage, she left school to take her place in the upper echelon of Iranian society.
My mother was in a household that had huge comforts in the sense of being served, being taken care of, not having to worry about material comfort or finances or any of that. She was mostly really valued for the way she looked more than anything else. And this is something that, satisfying as it was throughout her life, it wasn't enough. But at the same time, there was this terrible yearning for other things and extreme unhappiness with the limitations of the life that she was leading.
Haunted by regret for leaving school, Ferdoos would slowly come to a difficult decision. After 14 years of marriage and the birth of 3 children, she told her husband she wanted to divorce, support herself, and immigrate to the United States. Only there, she believed, could she become her own person.
She was thinking about one thing, that she wanted to pursue her education. She wanted to be an independent woman. And if it means that she would have to make a clean break with her past, give up everything, she would, if that's what it took.
San Francisco was half a world away and an entirely different culture. When Ferdoos arrived in 1955, she knew no English. Penniless, she took odd jobs as a waitress and a factory worker, all the while saving money for college.
I think my mother wanted to prove that on her own, without any support, any privilege, any connection to anything other than her own capabilities as a woman and as a person, that she could do what she wanted to do. And America was the place where that was possible.
By coming to the United States, Ferdoos not only changed her own destiny, but that of her 2 daughters, Mahnaz and Farah. Shortly after Ferdoos arrived, she brought over her 14-year-old daughter, Mahnaz. As the teenager watched her mother's struggle for independence, her own sense of womanhood began to evolve.
My father supported me when my mother brought me to the United States. And then I decided that I wanted to do it on my own and worked my way through college. It's kind of nuts, you know.
In 1967, after completing her studies, Mahnaz decided to return to Iran. The country was in the midst of rapid change, and Mahnaz believed her education could best be used to help Iranian women. 24 years earlier, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had ascended to the throne determined to bring Iran into the modern world. In 1963, he gave women the right to vote. Mahnaz saw an opening for change and joined Iran's fledgling women's rights movement. Soon, she became its leader. While Mahnaz was gaining prominence in Iran, her younger sister, Farah, was entering college in California. Strong-willed and spirited like her mother, she was developing her own political identity. Farah had lived in America since she was 10, but unlike her older sister, the adjustment had never been easy.
One of the things that had always bothered me was by the way my name was pronounced when I was a child and growing up in the United States. My full name is Farah. So you can imagine what that name, how that would be pronounced. Ferdoos, Ferdoos. I felt awkward. I felt as though I didn't belong.
In 1969, when she was 21, Farah went back to Iran to visit her sister.
I walked into the Mehrabad airport in Tehran, handed them my passport. The guy at the office looked at my passport and said, "Miss Farahnoz Ibrahimi, welcome home." When he said that, my heart I just thought, oh my God, I'm home, I'm home.
As Farah savored the sights and sounds of the country where she was born, she became aware of a growing dissatisfaction with the Shah. 6 years later, in 1975, the Shah abolished the multi-party system and made himself an absolute monarch. He crushed civil liberties and used his secret police to torture dissidents. Iranians began taking to the streets in protest. In America, young Iranian students supported the protesters in Iran with their own demonstrations to bring down the Shah. A student at Berkeley, Farah joined the movement. It was there that she met and married an Iranian engineering student named Farah. Together, they embraced a revolutionary zeal that put them in opposition to the more moderate Mahnaz.
I had become political, and from the time that my husband and I basically became a couple, we had a wonderful relationship with my sister. She disagreed with us. She argued forcefully with us whenever she came to the United States, and we would argue fiercely from morning to night, but our relations stayed close. And I was always proud of her. I was always proud of her accomplishments.
By 1976, Mahnaz's work for women's rights had earned her a place in the Shah's inner circle. When the Shah created the position of Minister of State for Women's Affairs, he offered it to Mahnaz.
I ran into someone and they said, "Oh, have you seen the international issue of one of the Iranian international papers?" And I said, "No." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because your sister's been named cabinet minister." And I said, "Okay, that changes everything." And I never called her. And I stopped talking to her.
I was very much conflicted. I didn't know whether I should accept or not. Does it work better if you're outside pressuring, or does it work just as well if you're inside pressuring? Should we or should we not? And finally, we decided that it's worth the experiment.
Are the old religious ways losing their force, or are they perhaps continuing to have a different type of force in Iran today?
Of course, there's a great deal of aggressive feeling, a great deal of fear of change. And of course, what I would like to point out is that this is not necessarily something which happens in Iran, or that's something which happens right now in Iran. That more or less it's a universal thing, that change, specifically in this area, always meets with a great deal of antagonism and aggression, especially if it happens too fast.
Under Mahnaz's leadership, Iran passed a family protection law that raised the legal marriage age of women from 15 to 18, gave women the right to divorce and custody of their children, and provided childcare in the workplace. The law rivaled the most progressive legislation found anywhere in the West. Many Iranian women took advantage of new opportunities. Some adopted Western tastes and habits. Viewing the changes as a plunge into decadence, the country's powerful Islamic clerics were outraged.
There were the conservative forces who didn't like what was happening, who didn't like my very visible position and the other women's very visible position. There was growing unrest. A large part of it had to do with the changes in the position of women.
In 1978, Iran descended into civil war. Opposition to the Shah's regime now included leftists, middle-class moderates, as well as Islamic fundamentalists. The Shah responded with further repression. The crisis deepened. Militants began assassinating members of the Shah's cabinet. On November 27th, Mahnaz was in New York for a meeting at the United Nations when she received a phone call from Iran. The clerics, she learned, were accusing her of warring with God. She could not go back.
It was a total shock and a numbing experience. My home, my family, my connections, my language, all of that was out of reach. And I had to start all over again redefining what it means to be me and who is this me.
Millions of Iranians were now joining the struggle to bring down the government. 6 weeks after Mahnaz went into exile, the Shah was forced to leave the country. On February 1st, 1979, the spiritual leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, returned from exile, promising to hold elections. For Farah, it appeared the forces of democracy had won. Jubilant, she and her husband decided to return to Iran and help build a new society.
I called my mother to tell her that I'm going to Iran. And Mahnaz answered the phone. And I hadn't talked to her, I think, in, I don't know, several years.
I was petrified when I heard Farah is going to Iran because unlike Farah, who had sort of an optimism coming from the kind of political activity that she had been following, for me, there was not a shred of doubt that what was going to come in Iran was blood and violence and, you know, dictatorship and a tremendous backsliding on rights, and especially on the rights of women.
I felt like there was such a chasm. I really felt like I was the spokesperson for the right side and that they were the spokesperson for the wrong side. The sense was that the revolution had been so encompassing of all strata of the population that there was no alternative but to go to a more pluralistic, democratic form of government.
On April 1st, Khomeini declared Iran an Islamic republic. The government immediately decreed that women cover themselves in public. Women had been full participants in the uprising against the Shah. Now, tens of thousands of them took to the streets to protest against the veil. They were no match for the new regime. During the next 3 years, women would lose most of their rights. Mahnaz's family protection law was overturned, the marriage age lowered to 9. Disobedience was punished by fines, beatings, and jail terms. Adultery was punished by stoning to death.
It was just extraordinarily painful. And of course, there was huge amounts of violence, and every day there were these terrible headlines about people killed, people machine-gunned, people executed, and it was just such an ugly time, such a violent time.
Farah and her husband were trapped. During the first year, Farah would give birth to a daughter. Playing the part of a young, happy family, they grieved in silence, as one by one, fellow students were rounded up and executed. On July 16, 1982, Farah was dragged away by the Revolutionary Guards. Farah knew he would be tortured. Her relatives rushed to find Kurdish tribesmen willing to smuggle her and her daughter out of the country. She was pregnant again.
You become numb to the immediate danger. It wasn't so much the fear that I had, but immense, incredible sadness. I thought that I would never see my husband again, even though I didn't want to believe it. And to see that I was leaving him behind and going in the opposite direction was an enormous weight on me. It consumed me through the whole trip. I was 8 months pregnant, and the terrain was very, very difficult. I was concerned about my baby.
After 5 days, Farah finally reached Turkey. 2 weeks later, she arrived in the United States, where she was met by her sister and mother. Ferdoos knew too well the strength Farah would need to start her life over. In September, Farah's son was born. 5 months later, it was Mahnaz who broke the news about Farah Mars.
I went to the office one day and I got the call that her husband had been executed. So I immediately returned and came home. And so she was sitting at the table So she was feeding her baby, and she saw me coming in, and she was surprised, you know, why are you home? And she kept asking, something has happened to this or that of our family or our friends. While obviously the one that it could possibly happen to was her husband, but she kept naming, oh, something's happened to this one, to that one, to the other one, you know. And finally she realized that it was her.
When Mahnaz brought me the news of my husband, and I had my son in my arms, I was feeding him. And the amazing thing was that he still needed to be fed, even though I had just heard that, you know, and the need to take care of my children and to make life consumed my first year and a half that I was in the States.
This is your first birthday, huh?
No, this was my second birthday because Nima was here.
As millions of immigrants had done before her, Farah would turn loss and sorrow into the building of a new life, raising her children, and eventually remarrying.
Oh, here it is. Here it is. Yeah.
Like so many exiles, Mahnaz never stopped fighting for her cause. She founded an organization dedicated to women's rights in the Muslim world. The sisters live near each other and take care of their elderly mother. Ferdoos had taught her daughters courage and determination. She had graduated college, received a master's degree, and gone on to a career in linguistics. She had become an independent woman.
She's really someone to be proud of from any generation and any country, what she's done. But to have been who she is from where she came from and to have done it is a small miracle.
So coming for that reason, that is, coming in order to be independent women in this country was a huge motivation for many women to come. She just happened to be one of the first wave from our part of the world.
It has been 10 years since Rodi Alvarado left Guatemala and filed for asylum. While she waits for a ruling, she works at a nursing home for elderly nuns.
We are your mothers.
My mother came from a place called Longford in Ireland.
Oh.
And she left her home when she was 17 years old and came here to America.
Oh.
When my mother came here, she was employed like you are. My mother's doing housekeeping.
Over the years, Rodi has become a central figure in the growing campaign to help women who flee nations that don't protect them from domestic abuse. A campaign which hinges on expanding the definition of a refugee.
In order to be recognized as a refugee, a person has to show that the harm that they fear is what we call persecution. And because many of the things that women suffer are part of the culture or considered cultural norms, there's been some resistance to recognizing that the harm that they suffer equals the persecution that is required in order to establish eligibility for asylum.
In San Francisco, Rodi learned that all across the globe, there are other women like her. She joined a group of Latina women with whom she could share her own painful experience as an abused woman in search of asylum.
Me ha ayudado a sacar, no sé, coraje, resentimientos, como lo hemos hecho varias mujeres. Y bueno, lo que yo sé de lo que se trata esto es para poder apoyar a otras mujeres que están emigrando o emigraron por violencia doméstica.
¿No será que los de migración tienen miedo, por ejemplo, darte la ayuda, a darte el asilo o los papeles como ellos quieran? Porque se pueden desatar casos más grandes atrás de ti que de verdad necesitan estar separados.
Sino lo que ha costado es de que si yo ganara mi caso, ellos no quieren que vengan otras mujeres atrás de mí. Ya, de que pues porque eso fue allá, no fue aquí. O sea, ese es el proceso, por eso ha sido tan largo, son 10 años, casi.
Y como dices tú, ¿verdad? La esperanza muere al último y hay que luchar.
Ya, pues,
y seguir adelante.
De eso se trata, luchar.
La esperanza muere al último.
Ya.
I think the thing we have to understand about asylum seekers is that for most people, they would say, if I could have stayed home and been safe, I would have. I really would have. You don't know, they'll say, how much it breaks my heart what I had to leave behind. And in Rodi's case, her odyssey really is an exemplar of that most unwilling of immigrants to the U.S.
Casi siempre sentí muchísimo miedo. No sé cómo explicarlo, pero es algo así como un frío que me persigue. O el fantasma que te persigue llega a meterte, como a tener malas ideas, como decir, no, prefiero morirme que estar en esta situación. Y gracias a Dios yo logré salir de eso, pero...
If Rodi wins her case, she will have made the U.S. government place women's rights violations on the same footing as human rights violations. In America, this unwilling immigrant has found her voice. The pain of breaking out of a cultural cocoon, one immigrant woman wrote, brings with it the possibility of an expanded universe.
This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
We are PBS.